so I'm going to kick off this event. So welcome everybody. I'm Bamos Charalambos. I'm the Shadow Minister for the Middle East and North Africa for the Labour Party. And this event is a joint event organised by the Foreign Policy Centre and SEPAD. This event is called the Dividing Lines, Reimagining Social Division in a Divided Society. This coincides with a publication from SEPAD and the Foreign Policy Centre. And we're going to bring together our three experts who are going to talk about the similarities and differences across divided societies using the concept of sectarianism to better understand the efforts to address division across the world. We've got three speakers. Three speakers are Professor Simon Mabon, Dr. Emmanuel Degli Esposti, and Professor John Nagle. Each of our three speakers will speak for between 6 and 7 minutes, and we'll take them in order. And then after all three have spoken, we'll have a Q&A session where people can ask questions. If you also post questions in the chat function, they'll be monitored and we can ask those questions at the end as well. And then we'll hopefully finish sometime just after 7 o'clock. So we'll see how we get on. So without any more ado, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, and that is Professor Simon Mabon, who's a director of SEPAD and Professor of International Relations at Lancaster University. So Simon, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bambos, for chairing this and for the welcome today. I must begin with a huge thank you to a number of people. First of all, to Poppy and Adam at the Foreign Policy Centre for turning this event around from an in-person event in the Palace of Westminster to this event online in the space of 48 hours and sorting out all the logistics of that. So Poppy, Adam, thank you so much. Thank you to Emmanuel, John and Bambos for joining us on the panel today. And thank you all of you for joining us as well, especially those in the UK who are struggling through what is a national climate emergency right now. I must also thank the Carnegie Corporation and the wonderful staff there who funded all of the work that SEPAD has been doing over the course of the past few years. And one of those bits of work that we've been doing is looking at this concept of sectarianism. And what we try and do in this report is to look at different forms of division across the world and use the concept of sectarianism as a means of understanding those forms of division. And there's a lot been written on questions of sectarianism in the context of the Middle East, in the context of Northern Ireland, historically in the context of the church. And yet very little has been done using this concept of sectarianism to try and understand other forms of social, religious division across the world. And this is what the report tries to do. It tries to use this concept of sectarianism as a form of a boundary-making process to understand different forms of political, social, ethnic, religious, tribal divisions in different contexts. One of the things that SEPAD has done over the past few years is tried to critically reflect on the ways in which sect-based difference emerges and evolves. And one of the key takeaways is this sense that context matters, that time and space matter, and that just because two groups that are broadly similar, for example, both member of community X and are posited against community Y in different places, it doesn't mean that they have exactly the same types of relationships. Indeed, these types of relationships are conditioned by the peculiarities of time and place. And these forms of conditioning are deeply intersectional. It's not just about identity markers per se. And that's one of the reasons why we want to move beyond a pure sort of identity politics framework, and why we think the concept of sectarianism is useful. because we think that the concept of sectarianism can allow us to understand the ways in which division is produced, reproduced, contested, and contextualized. That the concept of sectarianism allows us to understand the evolution of identities over time. It allows us to understand how rivalries between two communal groups can look dramatically different in two different places. And so that's what we try and do in this report. Use the concept of sectarianism as a means of understanding the nature, evolution, and contestation of division. And this plays out in lots of different contexts. Today, we have two speakers on the panel with me who focus more on the UK environment, but other contributors look at the case of Bosnia. There's a fantastic essay from Richard Johnson looking at the United States. And I think that's really powerful in the sense that it talks about how partisan identities become internalized and reproduced. And because of that internalization, and because of the increasing partisan nature of political identities in the United States, you get this really tribal, really toxic, and really fractious relationship that leaves many unwilling to back down, unwilling to compromise, and unwilling to even obey the rule of law, as we saw in the January 6 events, when the other is seen to win. And the concept of sectarianism, we think, helps us to understand why some of these things are playing out. But of course, there's an issue here. And one of the issues is, what even is sectarianism? As my contribution, the introduction to this report notes, there's no formal definition in Scots law. A colleague of mine, when at a game of football between Rangers and Celtic, he witnessed sectarian chanting, and he called a helpline that was set up to report such instances of hatred. And he said, I'd witnessed sectarian chanting. But because he'd used the word sectarian, his report, his flagging up of this issue, was discarded on the grounds that he himself was sectarian. And so here you have this real catch-22 of what's going on. And yet there is something really quite valid and really quite appropriate in using this approach. And as the introduction of the report shows, there are some, particularly the likes of Fanar Haddad, who say, look, we need to move beyond this. We need to move beyond sectarianism because it doesn't really allow us to talk about something in particular. It means people are talking past one another. But yet, as this report shows, and as a lot of the work being done by scholars of sectarianism, particularly in the Middle East, we think that the concept of sectarianism allows for implicit and explicit recognition of the processes of boundary making across time and space. And that such boundary making requires navigating the complex interplay of different, often intersectional identities and the ways in which these boundaries are, brackets close brackets, produced and contested over time. And what the essays in this collection are trying to do is to contribute to these developments, contribute to these understandings of communal difference by using the concept of sectarianism as a means of understanding the construction, reproduction, and contestation across time and space. And there are a couple of recommendations that we've come up with. They are split broadly into two categories. There's the analytical category and there's the policy-based category. So the analytical category is broadly to say, look, we need to avoid viewing communal conflict as a product of immutable ancient hatreds. We need to offer more nuanced analysis of communal difference beyond simplistic identity markers. And from that, we need to contextualize identities within broader socioeconomic moments. We need to avoid essentialism in analysis of communal tensions. And we need to acknowledge the importance of history, culture, and religion in understanding difference, but not to overstress it. And then those wanting to try and address some of these divisions, we encourage a move towards issue-based politics. We call for support to civil society initiatives that operate across communal groups. We call for the support to the emergence of issue-based political parties. We call for an avoidance of a one-size-fits-all approach to addressing communal violence. We call to support efforts to facilitate democracy and good governance. And these have all come out of the report, out of the myriad different bits of analysis across lots of different cases. And I think I've probably pushed the limits of Bambos's patience here. So apologies, Bambos. Thank you so much. I will leave my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, and plenty of food for thought there. Poppy has helpfully put the a link to a copy of the report on the group chat. So that's something we can, if people want to read, they can download the report from there. So please get onto the link if you want to read that further. Our next speaker is Dr. Emmanuel Degle Esposti, who is the Research and Outreach Associate at the Centre for Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge. Emmanuel, over to you now.
Thank you very much, and thank you also to Simon and Poppy for organising this event and for inviting me to speak today. So I wanted to, slightly on the back of what Simon proposed to you in terms of how we take this idea of sectarianism and potentially try and apply it in different contexts, but also to talk a little bit about my own work, which has been mostly looking at Shia Muslim minorities, both in the Middle East and in the UK and in Europe more generally. And one of the things that I have observed is the way in which Shia Muslims interact with Sunni Muslims, whether that's in a majoritarian context in the Middle East or whether that's in a minority within a minority context somewhere like the UK. And what has come out of that work is really how the context in which these minorities are operating really determines the way in which sectarianism manifests. And the contribution that I wrote for this particular report was focusing on the recent sort of debacle around the Lady of Heaven film, which came out earlier this year. For those of you who are not familiar, the film was sort of purportedly a historical retelling or sort of the daughter of the Prophet, Lady Fatima, and of her death, and of the sort of the surrounding contestation following the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And this film caused huge sort of problems within the Muslim community in the UK and elsewhere. There were protests that actually the cinemas ended up pulling the film as a result of the protests that happened specifically in in very Muslim majority cities in the UK, such as Bradford, Birmingham, Leeds, and also in London. And the film was also called sectarian by Muslims, by mostly Sunni Muslim communities, but also from Shia Muslims as well, partly because of the very specific interpretation and narrative of the sort of events following the death of the Prophet, which allegedly had a very specific Shia agenda. And I wanted to focus on this particular incident because on the one hand, it shows how sectarian categories are being mobilized, how these identities are being mobilized, how these ideologies are still, on the surface, you do see these currents of what appears to be almost primordialist antagonisms, where you have this sort of ideology dating back to the Prophet Muhammad. But if you scratch the surface, you realize that this is all a construction. And the way in which these supposedly antagonistic identities are being constructed is very much of the contemporary moment. So the film also attracted a lot of criticism because it compared some of the followers of the Prophet Muhammad to ISIS. And it was all very much bound up in the contemporary politics of Iraq and what's been going on in with the sort of resurgent sectarianism following the 2014 invasion of Mosul by ISIS. And so all of these threads sort of come together. And the other thing that I think was really interesting about this specific incident regarding this film is that even though the film was coming from an allegedly sectarian place, or allegedly sectarian ideology, it was criticized from both sides of the sectarian divide. So both Sunni and Shia Muslims came together to say, actually, no, we don't agree with this. This was a very fringe movement, and was supported by and backed by a very fringe and radical and controversial figure, Yasser Habib. And it actually represented a moment of cohesion, not just of tension. So I think the reason why I wanted to bring this up is to illustrate the fact that when we talk about sectarianism, often we take a lot of things for granted, especially when you look at the media reporting in the Middle East. There is this assumption that you have these things called sects, you have these Shia Muslims, you have these Sunni Muslims, and they hate each other because they've always hated each other. Whereas the reality on the ground is much more complex and much more nuanced than that. And it also changes over time. So, and the context in which specific identities or specific sort of sectarian
sorry, Emmanuel, you seem to have frozen. Emmanuel, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but you may need to reconnect. I'll give Emmanuel a few minutes. Hopefully, she'll be able to reconnect. If not, I think we'll just give her a few more moments. If not, I'll go straight over to John. This hot weather is playing havoc with everything from trains to people's internet connections. But let's hopefully see if we can get Emmanuel back soon. Okay, well, John, if you're ready, can I take you now, and we can maybe come back to Emmanuel if she's able to reconnect after we've dealt with you. So our next speaker is Professor John Nagle. John is the Professor of Sociology at Queen's University in Belfast. John, can I go to you now?
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for the invite and for preparing a really interesting and provocative report. So I'm going to make 4 very brief points, starting with Northern Ireland and then expanding outwards more generally about sectarianism and divided societies. So firstly, I think it's a really obvious point to say that no serious scholar or policymaker would credibly frame sectarianism in Northern Ireland through the frame of ancient hatreds or primordial clashes of religious identity, which we see, especially in terms of how the conflict in the Middle East is understood. The peace process in Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Belfast Agreement primarily recognize the ethno-national character of antagonistic divisions in Northern Ireland. So the institutions of the agreement, the power sharing, places emphasis on accommodating rival claims to national self-determination, whether it's Irish unity or UK unionism. And this is underpinned by the idea of giving parity of esteem to the identities that underlie these ethno-national aspirations. So what we've seen in terms of the post-agreement era is conflict moving away from political violence, which of course is a good thing, to expressions of identity, culture, and community. And, these kind of forms have been the main ground for dispute. And, I think we can actually say that group-based rights have become war by other means as nationalist and unionist political demands for public recognition and parity of esteem for their respective identities has become, one of the main sort of battlegrounds in contemporary Northern Ireland. So, basically what we're seeing there is kind of sectarianism and sectarian difference are mediated through conflicts over flags, symbols, language equality, parades. Even over the last kind of week or two with the celebrations to mark the Battle of the Boyne within sort of loyalist community, kind of populations, we've seen sort of, sectarian effigies of politicians being used on bonfires. And, this has, created this sort of context for, arguments and disputes about who, what sort of kind of cultural expressions should be seen as representative of communities. And what we're also beginning to see is new conflicts arising over kind of identity in relationship to kind of Brexit, but also LGBTQ rights. And it's really interesting to think that actually, the main sort of arguments about sort of the Northern Irish sort of protocol on the Irish Sea border is not just about sort of economics or material interests. It's actually really deeply ingrained in terms of symbolic and identity issues. So, unionist communities have opposed the sort of Irish Sea protocol, not just purely because of economic reasons, but because it's seen as a symbolic issue, which is making a distinction between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. So, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the mechanisms to deal with kind of culture, which was sort of inaugurated by the Good Friday Agreement, which kind of changed the nature of conflict away from political violence, the culture is not really kind of fit for purpose, because it's really sort of expedited these antagonistic kind of claims over identity and culture. But what it's also kind of showing is that the nature of this kind of boundary between the two groups can constantly change. It's not about these sort of primordial or essentialist issues over, sort of culture, but it's also about these kind of symbolic forms which are constantly changing, whether it's LGBTQ rights, gender equality, Brexit. All of these become sort of embroiled in this ethno-national conflict. But some good news here. I mean, although these kind of war on kind of rights and cultural conflicts have been quite destabilizing on governance institutions, and we've seen kind of governance institutions kind of collapse over kind of Brexit, language issues, kind of parades, flags, and whatever. At the same time, we've actually seen a decline of violent sectarian attacks over the last kind of 10 or 15 years. And kind of one reason for this is actually sort of power sharing has helped provide a sort of context for this sort of peaceful, way of kind of dealing with conflict rather than political violence. So the second point here is we kind of tend to focus on sectarianism as a structure of relationships between groups, but we often ignore how sectarianism and sectarian systems interact and impact on a wide range of kind of social groups. And, what we can see through kind of research and, in my own sort of research over the last kind of 10 or 15 years on divided societies is that, these kind of places which are impacted by sectarianism are also kind of likely to be affected by, gender inequality, anti-LGBTQ sentiment, and even sort of a marginalization of racial and ethnic minorities not formally included in peace agreements. And part of the reason for this is that these sort of divided societies often kind of create templates for in and out groups, which kind of risk in the long term sort of reproducing new forms of inequality and exclusion for kind of forms of identity which are not sort of formally included within sort of power sharing systems and so on. And actually, really sort of vibrant research on power sharing has identified key problems, not just in terms of sectarian clashes over culture and identity, but also in relationship, as I said, for gender equality, LGBTQ rights. And, when I look at sectarianism in Northern Ireland, we have to look in terms of how it intersects with a range of sort of other identities and issues. It's often sectarianism when it's manifest, it becomes quite misogynistic. And, I was just kind of talking a few minutes ago about bonfires in Northern Ireland over the last few weeks, and effigies of politicians being put on the bonfires. Well, it's actually the case that a lot of the time these effigies are actually of key female politicians, and, you know, kind of female politicians, policymakers who kind of dare to, you know, put their head above the parapet are often, you know, vilified and subjected to misogynistic sort of abuse. So, you know, what I'm trying to kind of point out here is that we need to sort of get away partly from the idea of sectarianism. It's just about sort of rival groups. It's actually much more kind of complex and nuanced, as Emmanuel said, and we need to look at sort of the divisions within sort of sectarian groups. You know, sectarian groups are never monolithic or homogenous. They're often kind of cleaved by class, gender, race, regionalism, disability, whatever. And, you know, this kind of helps us understand how kind of sectarianism operates within specific contexts, but also its kind of changing dynamics. So kind of third point and final point is relatedly on this, because we tend to concentrate too much on sectarian division, this obscures the kind of members of divided societies who in different ways defy easy categorization or refuse to categorize themselves or identify themselves in terms of kind of sect or nationalist-based identities. So, you know, divided societies often contain rich sort of socialist LGBTQ music subcultures, feminist organizations, and even political parties who express non-sectarian forms of political imagination and identity. And, you know, we tend to kind of dismiss these actors as being inconsequential or not important in the context of kind of divided societies, but they are really important actors in terms of fostering political and social change in these societies. And, you know, if we look at Northern Ireland and Lebanon, kind of two places where I do my research, we've seen in recent elections in May, the breakthrough of non-sectarian parties and candidates who show that there are sort of alternatives to the, I wouldn't call kind of simplistic sort of sectarian politics, but have provided sort of alternatives to this kind of form of political imagination. But at the same time, we need to recognize the extent to which the system is often kind of stacked against these non-sectarian political parties in divided societies. So, you know, for example, in Lebanon, where I've been doing quite a bit of research, we see ethno-sectarian elites use militias and henchmen to threaten to carry out violence against non-sectarian sort of actors. We see them using sort of, you know, the kind of media to delegitimize non-sectarian actors. And what this kind of tells us, I think, is that we kind of look too much at the resilience of sectarian systems and how they kind of reproduce themselves. And we think it's because sectarian identities and divisions are constantly being constructed. Actually, there's an alternative way to actually understand this. And actually, it's more important to think about how the survivability of these sectarian systems rest on closing down the space and delegitimizing non-sectarian alternatives. In other words, kind of, you know, trying to kind of destroy sort of diversity to make sure that non-sectarian alternatives have very limited space to exist. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. That's very thought-provoking as well about particularly the using of other areas to, once you've dealt with the sectarian issue, how the arguments are taking place elsewhere, and that leads to the issues there. I'm pleased to say that we have Dr. Emmanuel Degli-Esposti, who's back. I understand, Emmanuel, that you had a power outage. So
yes, I do apologize. I'm not entirely sure what happened. It may be because I'm living somewhere in the sticks in the country in the back end of nowhere, or it may just be because of the heat, but the whole house just shut off electricity, our alarm went off. It was all very dramatic, so I do apologize.
Well, we're pleased you're able to rejoin us. So
do I
yeah,
have a few minutes to just
of course, please carry on and please complete what you were saying. So you have time, so we'll extend the program, Elizabeth.
I mean, a lot of what I was saying, I think, echoes some of the sentiments that Simon and John have been saying, but there was one specific point I wanted to make about, so some of the work I've been doing is, I think when we talk about sectarianism, whether it's in policy circles or in journalistic circles, in the media, or whether even in academic circles, there is often this unsaid assumption that sectarianism is somehow bad or negative. There's a very normative language that we use around the idea of sectarianism. And one thing that came out from my research specifically on Shia minorities in Britain is how sectarianism can also sometimes be positive. It can have this emancipatory quality. So specifically with my research on Shia Muslims in the UK, there has been a sense in which having a very specific Shia Muslim identity, rather than say just being a British Muslim, has been something that has been actually quite a positive step for the Shia community in terms of trying to differentiate themselves, to seek recognition, to gain recognition for specific rituals that they have, that they can practice in the UK in the way that they can't practice, say, back in Iraq or in Lebanon or in Pakistan, where they may have faced discrimination or even potentially being killed for their beliefs. So there is a sense in which the manifestation of a sect-based identity can also be a positive thing. And of course, that also opens a can of worms in terms of, well, what then is then the relationship with the other sect when you have that sort of identity. And that's something I do a lot of work on in my own research. But just to put that out there, that sectarianism doesn't always have to be bad. And perhaps one of the things that we should consider as academics and as policymakers is when we're looking at divided societies and sect-based identity categories, to try and get away from any kind of normative assumptions that we might have when approaching those. So that was the point I wanted to wrap up on, and I will hand back to you.
Thank you, Manuel, and that's another very thought-provoking aspect, that sectarianism isn't necessarily bad, that it can help with our identity, particularly if the minority is in another country. So thank you for that point. I'm now going to turn to questions. So I should also point out that there are, Poppy's been posting a number of links in the chat. So please, if you want to find out more information about what's been said by some of our panelists, please go onto the chat link and you will see some of the links there for contributions that have gone into the report. You've got a number of questions that have been posted. So I'm just going to take the ones that have been posted. If other people have got questions, I'm not sure how we're going to this. If attendees have got questions, then if they could indicate by, well, I'm not going to be able to see them actually, so I think Poppy will be able to see them. If you could raise your hand and we'll call you to ask your question. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask the questions that have been tabled. So the first question is from Dr. Mahmood Khan, and it is, do you think that the global movers and shakers of power, politics and conflicting doctrines are the main actors of increasing sectarianism in the Middle East? Who wants to try that one? Shall I read that again? So it's, do you think that the global movers and shakers of power, politics and conflicting doctrines are the main actors of increasing sectarianism in the Middle East? I can see Simon with his hand up. So Simon.
Sure. Thanks. I'll give that a shot. I think it's a really, really important question, and it gets to something that comes out in the report, namely this interplay between the sort of the broader structural factors that are shaping sect-based identities and relations with others, and then agency as well. And while it's clear that the sort of global powers, the movers and shakers, as the question puts it, have got a role to play in shaping the broader sort of structural context in which groups and individuals operate, I think it's important not to ignore or dismiss the power that individuals and individual sort of localized communities have, as John was getting at in his contribution there, and as one of the other contributors in the edited collection, Julia Carabelli, talks about, agency is really important. People have a role to play in all of this. People aren't just passive bearers of identities. They're not just controlled by the sort of the overarching hegemonic structural determinants of life. They have a role to play. And I think that's really important to remember. Of course, global powers have a disproportionate amount of power in a lot of different contexts, and they have a role to play, good, bad, often a bit of both. But people also have a role to play as well. So it's the important thing to remember is that when we're looking at these things, it's understanding the interplay between the two, that age-old question of structure and agency.
Thank you, Simon. And I'm going to take the next two questions together because they relate to a similar theme. So the first one is, do you think the unending power struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran has spoiled the sustainable peace in the Middle East? And I think if you want to apply that to sectarianism, is it a Shia versus Sunni sort of conflict that's going on there, or is it something else? And the second question is, do you think that the unresolved Israel-Palestine issue is one of the main reasons for instability in the Middle East? So two very big questions there. So who wants to have a stab at that one? I can see Emmanuel. Emmanuel, over to you.
I think I'll have a stab at the first one. I don't know if the second one is potentially relates to it, but let's see how it comes out. But I think with regards to the ongoing rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that obviously does have a significant impact in the region. It is, on the one hand, you do have an ideological struggle there in the sense that Iran is an Islamic state. It is run in a very specific interpretation of Shia Islam, and it's also a specific interpretation of Shia Islam. It's not just an interpretation of Islam, which is Shia. There are many Shia in and outside of Iran who also disagree with a specific interpretation that Iran has. So, and also Saudi Arabia is run by a very specific interpretation of Sunni Islam. So there is, in a sense, there is an ideological conflict there, but I would tend to say that the true nature of the conflict is more geopolitical, and often the ideological conflict is grafted onto the geopolitics. So yes, you do have differing opinions and you do have differing interpretations of sect and of religion, but really it's about who controls power in the region, who controls the resources, who controls the Gulf, and the history of, going back to the history of the conflict between the Persians and the Arabs, which Iran love to refer to. So I think it does have a significant impact in the region, but I think the ideological content of it is often overstated. And I think the same could potentially be said of the Arab-Israeli conflict, in that I think the enduring legacy of Israel-Palestine has been, I mean, there are many enduring legacies of Israel-Palestine, but one of the main enduring legacies is the mass expulsion of people that happened in 1948, and that has essentially created the country of Jordan, created enduring refugee camps in and around the countries, in Lebanon and Syria. You have large numbers of Palestinian refugees. You have large numbers of Palestinian refugees outside of the Middle East and the Palestinian diaspora. And I think that is really one of the biggest legacies of the conflict, and how that has then shaped the politics of the region and the societies of the region and outside the region. But I think the ideological conflict between the land itself, again, the sort of the religious element of it, I think is often overstated. I think, again, it's more about resources, it's more about specific histories and narratives that have come to be mobilized in conflict with each other, but can I think maybe perhaps John would be able to step in here, because there are some parallels with the situation in Northern Ireland, in the sense that you have these identities that become so entrenched, and the politicization of those identities is so entrenched that there is almost no way out of that. And I'm going to leave it there, but yeah, let's see.
John, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I would probably challenge the idea that sort of ethno-national identities are so sort of firmly entrenched here that they can't be ameliorated or kind of changed. You know, we've seen since the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 that political violence has been vastly reduced. People are more sort of willing to engage in new kind of forms of identity making and political imagination, whether it's through kind of political parties, feminist sort of organizing, LGBTQ, whatever. You know, I think kind of the important thing to always kind of bear in mind is that in sort of situations of inequality, sectarianism is more likely to kind of flourish. We need to kind of bring in the political economy of understanding this. And, you know, a lot of these sort of issues have been sort of dealt with through the lens and the framework of a Good Friday Agreement. So the sort of inequality and sort of insecurity, which, you know, kind of led to kind of violence here, has been largely addressed. I mean, we could argue about, you know, there are kind of issues which need to be kind of dealt with, but that has given this sort of framework for new forms of kind of political imagination to kind of, you know, arise and to kind of flourish. So maybe I'm a little bit sort of more optimistic on this than maybe some other people.
Thank you, John. Shall I go on to the next question, which is, do you think the recent visit of the US President Biden to the Middle East may decrease sectarian issues in the Middle East, having increasing proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Obviously, we've seen that there is currently a truce in Yemen, which is one place people could argue there has been a proxy war. I'm not sure President Biden's visit has actually achieved that much. I may be wrong, but anybody want to have a stab at that? Simon.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I'm inclined to agree with you, Bambos. I think what this visit has done is it's tried to recalibrate Saudi relations with the United States, and perhaps the other way around, Washington's relationship with Saudi, in the sense that in the early days of his presidency, Mr. Biden talked about making the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia a pariah state, and now he's on Air Force One going to the kingdom to try and secure the relationship, but also to secure up global oil markets and meet the various pressures domestically, which I think is quite a difficult pill for him to swallow, given what he's previously said. But it also shows the broader sacrifice of humanitarian goals and the humanitarian goals that the Biden administration may have had on the altar of realpolitik again. So I think it's actually quite a gloomy visit. The one saving grace is perhaps there may have been discussion with regard to what the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia wants for a nuclear deal to be made and what price they would expect from Washington for the deal to be made. For example, back when the first deal was made, Riyadh, it's generally acknowledged that Riyadh said, we will agree to this, but we're going to go into Yemen and deal with the Houthi problem. So it's a question of to what extent are the Americans willing to acquiesce on this in the context of this broader set of questions and games. But the one bit of positive sort of takeaway from this is that the Saudis and the Iranians, I think, are working more and more towards a normalization. Perhaps is a bit strong. A rapprochement is perhaps a bit more appropriate, neither side wants to descend into worsening hostilities. Both have pragmatic elements in their governments, even if there are also hardline elements in the various regimes in Riyadh and Tehran. And for anyone wanting to read more on this, I must give a shout out to a piece written by two of my PhD students, one from Saudi Arabia, one from Iran, both of whom arguing that it's in the pragmatic national interest of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran to have a thought in relations with one another.
Simon, if you could share that piece with us, then put a link, that would be
I will do that right now.
Appreciated. Thank you. I'm going to go on to the next question. So this question is, I wonder whether you agree that outsiders often want to understand things by looking for the binary divisions formed by sectarianism, rather than looking for the non-sectarian groups who seem to be challenging the status quo and creating or pointing out diversity, the more in common than what divides them prism. So that's an interesting one, whether we choose to view things via a sectarian prism when actually that may not be the best way to view things. I don't know if John or Emmanuel want to have a stab at that one.
Hi, Emmanuel. Do you want to go first or shall I?
You can go first.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. It's a really important question, and it touches on the research I've been doing for 2 decades on so-called non-sectarian movements. Kind of the main point I want to make here is I don't want to kind of dismiss sort of the power of ethno-nationalism or sectarianism or whatever. I agree that these kind of forces are kind of constructed, and once they become constructed, they can become sort of ontologically real. And what I mean by this is, although we know that sectarianism or primordialism is not something kind of genetically inherited or anything like this, or biologically determined, if people actually believe in these identities and it dictates their kind of political preferences, when it does become real. And we see this in Northern Ireland, 90% of the population vote for ethno-nationalist parties, whether it's unionist or nationalist. And it's the same in Lebanon. Most people vote for sectarian parties. So it's a powerful force which needs to be kind of dealt with. But at the same time, we need to understand that on the one hand, that these ethno-national or sectarian groups are never homogenous or monolithic, but always kind of cleaved by various forms of identities, and these can be arranged kind of hierarchically, whether it's kind of gender, sexuality, regionalism, disability, all of the things which I've spoken about. Class, of course, is really important. So these kind of sectarian sort of formations are never really kind of stable because of this, and in order for them to actually sort of function and perform in the way in which we need to do, they need to kind of capture everything, every sort of form of kind of social identity. It needs to kind of permeate into everything. And the kind of second point here is that, because of this, is we kind of sometimes do ignore the fact that people can mobilize via alternative forms of political mobilization and imagination, whether it's LGBTQ mobilization, feminist, as I say, kind of class-based. And what makes them kind of non-sectarian is, often the sort of membership which these groups are kind of made up of. They embrace kind of citizens from all sort of different dimensions of society, and they can be really sort of important vehicles for kind of change in these societies. I'm looking at sort of a protest in Lebanon, which have been ongoing since 2019. More than 1 million people kind of took to the streets in Lebanon. And, people often kind of dismiss these kind of protests as being irrelevant or whatever, but 1 million people out of a population of 4 million. And it was across Lebanon. It took into account people from all different sects, identities, so on. And, the whole purpose of that sort of protest movement is to provide this sort of alternative to kind of sect-based kind of politics. So, they are sort of important actors in divided societies. And, I think what we need to understand is in our sort of research that we often focus too much on sectarian divisions without sort of taking into account the plurality, heterogeneity within these sort of formations, but secondly, that there's also kind of different ways of mobilizing, organizing, which can provide really important forms of kind of social change, whether it's LGBTQ rights, gender equality, you know, labor politics, whatever.
I may also just briefly onto that question. I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it also touches on something that is problematic in general when we're talking about places like the Middle East, but it relates to the study of the sort of the global South in general, in that we tend to see sectarianism as something that happens over there. It's not something that happens here. It's something that, you know, those backward, non-white, or in the case of, you know, the Irish, but there was all these sort of historical prejudices that are bound up with the idea of sectarianism. And I think it also touches on the next question, which if you permit me to read it out, it says, do you think Islamophobia and white man supremacy is the latest form of sectarianism? Which I think, again, brings up this idea that actually perhaps sectarianism isn't something that is just happening over there, that we can use this concept, which is what this report is doing. We can take the concept of sectarianism and apply it at different places into different contexts. And I would, to answer that question very briefly, I would say yes, I think Islamophobia and white supremacy is a form of sectarianism, but it takes different forms and it has a slightly different context. And so you can't just say that in a blanket statement and then compare one context to another without understanding that it's actually the specificities of the context within which that term is operating that make it sectarian. So it doesn't transcend the context. But yes, I think this tendency to assume that sectarianism is something that is other is something that we have to try and move beyond.
We've got 2 more questions on the chat, so I'll try and go to those. And if we don't have any more after that, then I think we can try and. I've sort of got 3 more questions now, but we'll make those the last 3. And so the first one is, how do you feel a greater understanding of the depth and intersection of sect relations can help with not only gaining a better grasp for the central reason for conflict, but also in diffusing conflicts, such as in countries like Syria, for example? I can see Simon and John have got their hands up. So Simon,
I'll kick over to John unless he fancies the Turkey question.
John?
I'll leave the Turkey question to the experts. Yeah, Sam, I think that's actually a really interesting question, because what we know is that more sort of inclusive sort of peace agreements and peace processes are in terms of dealing with intersectional sort of identities, you know, gender, class, sexuality, and so on. The more likely these agreements are to be successful in the long term. This is kind of one of the major kind of problems, isn't it, with peace agreements, wherever you can find them, that the main sort of function of these peace agreements is to recognize and accommodate the main sort of sectarian groups, because these are the groups seen as being involved in sort of conflict. And because these kind of peace processes are hammered out under kind of duress, under really sort of stressful conditions, that, you know, it often sort of excludes the voices of women, sexual minorities, whatever sort of labor movements. But you know, there is a sort of growing trend, I think, within sort of scholarship and policy making to recognize that sort of bringing in these voices, especially within sort of peace processes, does make for more sort of durable and successful peace processes. And, you know, Northern Ireland is probably a good example of some of, you know, the kind of, you know, problems with this. You know, although kind of women were, you know, given some sort of voice within the sort of peace process, it was very kind of quickly sort of marginalized. There was no sort of dispensation within the Good Friday Agreement really for recognizing LGBTQ rights or class or anything like this. and these sort of issues have sort of gradually re-emerged and poked up their head, you know, as sort of issues which haven't really adequately been dealt with. So yeah, I think it's a really important question to deal with.
Thank you, John. I'll go on to the next question now. So it's about the report. So this is from Mustafa. It says the report equates religiously based sectarianism with secular sectarianism, as highlighted in the piece on India. How far does this approach undermine the role of religion as an independent factor in the sectarianism process? And can we deal with the religion as an epiphenomenal factor in such a process? So I see John having his hand up. John, do you want to try that one?
Sorry, I just lost the sound there for.
Sorry, or Simon. Simon's got his hand up. Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Bambos. And thank you, Mustafa, for this wonderfully tricky question at 7 o'clock on a hot evening. I think it's an important question. It gets really to the heart of discussions of sectarianism. What is it that we're even talking about here? Because it's easy to reduce some of these things to just pure identity politics, right? We've got difference between two communal groups. Well, why do we even need to talk about sectarianism? Why don't we just say this is an identity-based issue? And I think that is it's easy to understand the appeal of that, but I think the concept of sectarianism can be applied beyond religion when we're looking at certain types of things that are happening. One of them is this process of deviation from a collective whole. And I think that's quite important when we're looking at the emergence of sect-based tensions. So historically, when we look at sectarianism within Christianity, you see church and sect, of course, with sect as a deviation from the church and moving away. Now, that doesn't really work in other faiths, but the idea of a sort of a schism emerging from a collective whole, I think, does work in a non-hierarchical sense. Sorry, my brain jumped a couple of things when I saw an intruder in the bottom of my screen. But in the Christianity context, there's a hierarchical sort of church and then sect. But in Islam, for example, you don't have that hierarchical form of difference, but you do have a deviation from a collective whole. So you have different sects, all part of the same Islamness. And I think when you have that deviation, you can have that in different ways. It can be about religion, but can also be about geographical location. It can be about ethnicity. It can be about tribe. It can be about lots of different things, as long as there is a deviation from a collective whole and a schism from that collective whole. And then the important thing that we're getting at in this report is how those identities are then reproduced, politicized, and difference becomes internalized and reproduced over time. So it takes on a fractious relationship, but one that is sticky, one that isn't easily resolved just by sitting people down in a room for an afternoon of activities. There's something more to it than that. And I think that's where sectarianism is a useful concept, because it allows us to look at different arenas. Like AJ Godavartri's piece in this collection looks at sectarianism in India, which isn't so much about religion, although it is about religion, it's also about caste and the serious caste-based tensions that are playing out across the Indian state, which are then intersecting with geography, with class, with faith, but also intra-Hindu tensions, and then Hindu-Muslim tensions, Hindu-Sikh tensions, Muslim-Sikh tensions, which are mapping onto all these different things. So religion is but one part of a very complex story. Sorry, that was a very, very long answer. I apologize.
Thank you, Simon. Very comprehensive, thank you.
May I just also add something there?
Yes, Emmanuel, yes, please come in.
Sorry, I don't want to go over time. I apologize for the intrusion.
Don't worry at all, don't worry at all.
I think the idea of religion as an epiphenomenal factor is one that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with, possibly because I think there is something specific about religion as well. So we use sectarianism. Sectarianism as a term comes historically from Christianity, and which Simon has just gone into in terms of the differences between sort of sect in Christianity, sect in Islam have different meanings. And I agree with him in the way that I think sectarianism as a concept can transcend that and can be used to apply to different contexts. But I think when you have religious sectarianism, there is also something qualitatively different about that. And religion is not just an epiphenomenal process, but religion is a multitude of all different factors that encompasses lived reality and ideology and belief and practice and everyday life and all sorts of this sort of nexus of how people live that you can't just reduce to something epiphenomenal. So I just wanted to add that in there, but yeah.
Coming to the next question, which is from Theodorou. How do you see the Turkification of occupied Cyprus, a European country, and the Turkish Cypriots becoming a minority as a result of the change of the demography by Turkey, who have colonized the occupied north by Turkey? So that's a very specific one. Don't know who wants to have a go at that one.
I mean, I'm not an expert on Turkey or Cyprus, but I would point Theo to a very good book by my colleague at Cambridge, Yana Varyashin, who wrote a book called The Make-Believe State. I think it came out in 2012, which is specifically about the Turkish Republic of Cyprus. So I would point him to that.
And Simon.
Just very quickly, and again, I'm not anyone who would claim expert knowledge and expertise on either of these issues, but I think what this issue does highlight is the importance of contextualizing these types of debates, these types of relationships, and bringing in the sort of the intersectional analysis into an understanding of what is at its very simplest level, intercommunal tensions. But of course, it's far, far more than that. It's spatial, it's demographic, it's economic, it's colonial. And I think the question points to the importance of bringing in an intersectional analysis into what could be a very, very simplistic analysis, but is actually much, much more complex than that surface analysis would allow.
Thank you, Simon. And the last question is, so Professor Mabon commented on the now friendly rivalry between Lancashire and Yorkshire. What are the historical, cultural, economic, etc. ingredients to make for a peaceful, successful, and friendly rivalry? So Simon, you have to go back on that one. You have to answer this one.
I think so. As a Yorkshireman living in Lancashire and struggling with some of those relationships when it comes to the quote unquote Roses weekend, I think it's important to reflect on. And I think Drury's question is really important as well when we're trying to look at what can be done in other contexts and what should be done and how those contexts, tensions can evolve. And I think there's a really important word here, time. Sadly, conflict, tension takes time to resolve. But there's also an intermingling, an interaction of peoples, not just the doubling down of communities. We see that in divided cities that John's done a great deal of work on, that when there are spaces through which people from different communities can interact, even just walking past one another, you break down the stereotypical assumptions about the other. You start to build up a degree of trust. You start to have those interactions. You eventually start to get into communal marriages, get into communal sporting engagements. And then those communal rivalries, if it's all done in a positive, carefully mediated, context-specific way, you can start to get a transition to friendly rivalries that don't have a risk of then exploding in all types of negative things over time. But it takes time, of course.
Thank you, Simon. And I think John wants to come in on that one.
Thanks. I'm definitely not an expert on Yorkshire or Lancashire, but I think it provocatively, it may show how rivalries and divisions can actually be invented through tradition. My actual kind of understanding of the Wars of the Roses were it was a conflict between rival houses, York and Lancaster, who had absolutely nothing to do with either Yorkshire or Lancashire, and actually the House of York, I think its power base was in Kent. So actually Simon is more of a kind of southerner if he kind of ascribes to this sort of Yorkshire identity, because as I say, that's where most of the kind of conflict was actually contested. Maybe I'm kind of rambling here, but I think what it does kind of show that how these rivalries can actually be sort of forged out of sort of false memories and kind of new forms of kind of tradition, which actually have nothing to do with the original sort of basis of conflict.
Thanks for that, John, that historical context. I'm sure that many Manchester United and Leeds fans will take that to heart. We've come to the end of our session, so I just want to say a big thank you to our three panelists, Professor Simon Mabon, Professor John Nagle, and Dr. Emmanuel Degli-Esposti, for their incredible contributions to today's discussion. There are links on the chat for some of the references that Simon, John, and Emmanuel referred to, so please click on them if you want to find out more information. And thank you all to everyone who's signed up and attended today's session. It's been very illuminating. I've certainly learned a lot, and I look forward to reading the papers myself and learning far more about it. So thank you all for your time. Hopefully enjoy a cooler tomorrow. Thank you all.
Thanks, Bambos. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Poppy. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.